Hello and welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about existential import uh, and the square of opposition. We have talked about the traditional and Aristotelian square of opposition. Now we are going to learn about the modern and the Boolean square of opposition. But in order to understand that, we must first understand what is existential import and what are the problems the Aristotelian square of opposition is facing if we are not taking into consideration the concept of existential import. So it is a very important concept for us to move on to the next section, that is the drawing of Venn diagrams of categorical propositions. So it is very important for us to understand existential import and the Boolean interpretation of the square of opposition with respect and in contrast to the Aristotelian square of opposition. So let's begin.
Why do we need to study about existential import? Categorical propositions are the building blocks of arguments, and our aim in logic is to analyze and evaluate arguments. You also know that it is easier to represent arguments with the help of diagrams, Venn diagrams, uh, uh, and symbolize the AEIO propositions. To be able to do this diagram and symbolize the categorical propositions, we need to understand existential import. If we understand the existential import, then we will also understand the Boolean interpretation of the square of opposition. Now, George Boole pointed out some problems pertaining to the categorical propositions and the square of opposition, which was traditionally framed by Aristotle. The interpretation of categorical propositions, the new interpretation. George Boole gave a new interpretation which emerges from the resolution of the controversy has to be understood. And this new interpretation of the relation between categorical propositions and their status is known as the Boolean interpretation of the categorical proposition. So, to understand the Boolean interpretation, we need to understand the concept of existential import beforehand. A proposition is said to have existential import if it is uttered to assert the existence of objects of some kind. And both Aristotle and George Boole accept that the particular propositions I and O always have existential import, which means that the classes designated by the subject terms of the I and O propositions are not empty. The subjects are existing. For example, some soldiers are heroes. This is a I proposition, and it means that there exists at least one soldier who is a hero. Similarly, the O proposition, some dogs are not companions, states that there exists at least one dog that is not a companion. So, the subject term, uh, the dogs or the soldiers, they are not empty, neither are they fictitious. They are existing. And how many of them are existing? At least one. So if this much is asserted by a proposition, then the proposition is said to have existential import. Now, the particular propositions I and O have EI, that is existential import, is not disputed by anybody. Anybody means Aristotle or George Boole. Both of them accepted it. There was no controversy over this. Then where did the controversy lie? The controversy was regarding the A and E propositions, which are the universal propositions. So, whether universal propositions A and E also have existential import is the issue on which Aristotelian and the Boolean interpretations of proposition will differ.
We know that the I proposition and the E proposition, they follow validly from their corresponding universal A and E proposition. So the A proposition, all spiders are eight-legged animals. From here, we infer validly the I proposition. Some spiders are eight-legged animals. And according to the traditional square of opposition, this is the relation of superaltern and subaltern, and we say that it is a valid inference. Now we know that the I proposition, the particular, has existential import, which means there exists at least one spider which is a eight-legged animal. Okay, so where are we deriving this I proposition? We are deriving this I proposition from the A proposition, which says all spiders are eight-legged animals. So it is commonsensical to assume that if the I proposition has existential import, then obviously the A proposition must also have existential import. We cannot say the subject class in the A proposition, that is spiders, does not exist. Don't you think? Because it has to exist. Otherwise, how can I derive the particular of at least one spider from the universal proposition of A? So if I and O proposition have existential import, and they follow validly from their corresponding A and E proposition, then A and E proposition must also have existential import. This is the commonsensical view, and this is also the Aristotelian view, because proposition with existential import cannot be derived validly from another proposition which does not have any such existential import. If the subject class of A or E is non-existent, then how can we infer that some at least one of that subject class exists in the I proposition? We cannot do that. Therefore, this is actually the point of contradiction between George Boole and Aristotle. But as far as Aristotle is concerned, he granted existential import also to the universal propositions A and E. In contrast, George Boole argued that we cannot infer the truth of a particular proposition from the truth of its corresponding universal proposition if A and E are also granted existential import. Now let us try to understand this problem with an example. All goblins are green is a universal affirmative A proposition. From this, we can validly infer the corresponding particular I proposition, which definitely has existential import, and we can say that some goblins are green, which means that there is at least one goblin, and that is green, which again means that there are green goblins, but there actually aren't. Have you seen any green goblins? No, I don't think anybody ever has. So the subject is imaginary and actually do not exist. Therefore, the A proposition from which I proposition was derived cannot be said to have existential import. The modern interpretation of categorical propositions have solved this problem by translating the universal proposition A and E into conditional statements. So what is meant by this? That okay, A and E are not supposed to have existential import. So when I say all SSP, what am I supposed to understand? That A don't exist, okay, fine. Then how do I interpret this sentence, the statement? We are supposed to understand it as a conditional statement that if there is S, then it will be predicated with P, something like this. Okay, if it is conditional, then you're not, it is not a definite assertion. Then the problem will be removed. That is, A and E are conditional statements without existential import, which means we should interpret A and E propositions like this. If there is such a thing as a goblin, then it is green. We are not assuming, we are not asserting that goblins are existing. Instead, we are saying that if there is such a thing as a goblin, then it is green. Now, problems regarding the contradictory relation between A and O, E and I will also arise if A and E are granted existential import. Now, two propositions are contradictories if one is a denial or negation of the other. That is, they both cannot be true and they both cannot be false. So now suppose all men are mortal is true. Then some men are not mortal will be false because they are contradictories. But the A proposition says all men are mortal. Here, till now, we were talking about imaginary and fictitious objects which cannot be granted existential import. Now, this is another aspect of universal proposition. That is, the word universe is very significant. The word universal. All men means all men of all time, of all places, everywhere, past, present, and future. So when you're saying all men are mortal, have you seen all men? No, nobody ever has, and nobody ever will. So we do not even know if it is true or false. This is the nature of universal. We have not seen all men, so universal propositions cannot be granted existential import as they are never conclusive. They are only probable, they are highly probable, but conclusive, no. We can at most say that if there is such a thing, such a being as man, then it is mortal. Okay, so maybe it is highly possible that some man in some dimension in some other planet is not mortal. And one counter example is enough to prove that the A proposition, all men are mortal, is false. So how can we ascertain universal generalizations? We cannot ascertain universal generalizations because of their very characteristic. It becomes false then. What becomes false? The universal proposition that all men are mortal. It will be false because someday in near future, maybe a man will come who will be immortal. Then this proposition will become false. So now if the A proposition, because of its characteristic universal nature, it becomes false, then what will happen? The corresponding contradictory O proposition will also become false. And then we know that contradictories cannot be false together. If one is true, the other must be false. So here we see that the contradictory relations between AO and EI are also not holding up. Now, just like we had problems with contradictory relation if A and E are assigned existential import, similarly, we will encounter some anomalies in the contrary relation between A and E if they are assigned existential import. In the contrary relationship, both cannot be true together, but both can be false together. Now, if I say the A proposition, all flying horses are golden, and the E proposition, no flying horses are golden. what will you say? Are they true or they false? Now, in order to say true or false, you have to admit first that there exist some flying horses. Based on that, only you'll be able to say, isn't it? If they do not exist, that is, flying horses do not exist, then you can say both of them are true, or you can also say that both of them are false. But since you can say that both of them are true, then what happens is the contrary relation between A and E are compromised. This is one example I'm just stating in order to explain. Here it is written, all unicorns have wings and no unicorns have wings. The first of these asserts only that if there is a unicorn, then it has wings. The second asserts only if there is a unicorn, then it does not have wings. Now, if there are no unicorns, then both can be true. Agreed, both can be false, but there is a possibility that both can be true together. Since A and E both are becoming true, there is a possibility that both A and E can become true together. Therefore, we can say that the contrary relation is getting compromised because we are assigning existential import to A and E. Now let's see what will happen to the sub-contrary relation which holds between I and O. Remember that sub-contraries cannot be false together. They can be true together but never false together. Now we have seen that A and E can be both false. If they are both false, then the particulars that we are deriving from the universals, that is I and O, they will also become false together. But according to the tradition of sub-contrary rules, I and O, even though they can be true together, can never be false together. Hence, we can see not only the contrary, but also the sub-contrary relation collapses. I and O propositions, because they do have EI, cannot be false if the subject class is empty. Thus, the sub-contrary relation does not hold any longer, and this is all happening because we have assigned existential import to the universal propositions which are A and E. So we have seen that the contrary relation between A and E have collapsed because both can be shown to be true together. The sub-contrary relation between I and O has also collapsed because both have been shown to be false together. Now, what about the subalternation relation? Inferring an I proposition from its corresponding A and an O proposition from its corresponding E is also not valid. This is because plainly one may not validly infer a proposition that has an existential import from one that does not have an existential import. So the superalternation and subalternation relation also becomes invalid. We have also discussed this at the beginning of this video. Now, because of all these problems, the interpretation and faulty inferences, the Aristotelian interpretation was replaced by the Boolean interpretation. And what do we have exactly in the Boolean interpretation? The contrary, the sub-contrary, and the superalternation, these three relations do not hold anymore, then I and O propositions do have their existential import, and most importantly, the A and E, these two universal propositions do not have any existential import anymore. So this is entirely coherent because in the Boolean interpretation, the universal propositions are interpreted as having no existential import. They are only understood as conditional statements. So even when the subject class is empty, The proposition all S is P can be true, and also the E proposition no S is P can be true, and both being true together doesn't cause any problems. For example, the proposition all unicorns have horns and no unicorns have horns both may be true even if there are no unicorns. Why? Because we are not assigning or we are not claiming that there are unicorns or there are no unicorns. That is, no existence claim is being made. So even if there are no unicorns, both may be true. But as far as the particular propositions are concerned, if there is no unicorn, then they will become false. Like some unicorns have horns will become false. So here you can see both the squares in front of you, the traditional and the modern. In the traditional, you can see A is written as all SSP, E is no SSP, O is some S is not P, and I is some S is P. At the same time, you will see that A and E have contrary relationship. I and O are subcontraries, and AI and EO are superalterns and subalterns in the relation of subalternation. But in the modern square or the Boolean square of opposition, you will see that the only relation which is visible here is that of contradictories. And which are the contradictory propositions? AO and EI. Now, A is represented as SP bar is equal to 0. E is represented as SP is equal to 0. I is represented as SP not equal to 0, and O is represented as SP bar is not equal to 0. This is exactly what we are going to learn in the next video so that you can draw Venn diagrams to represent and infer the validity of arguments. So that's all for now. In the next video, we'll learn symbolism and diagrams for categorical propositions based on the modern square of opposition, which was given by George Boole.